Good evening, friends. Welcome. And this is our final Bible study with the Reverend Dr. Liz Theoharis. We've been on quite a journey with her through the month of February. We've been invited to see Jesus's observation that the poor are always with us as an indictment on existing socioeconomic inequality, rather than a prophetic prediction for God's intended future. We've learned that rendering unto Caesar with the face of oppression engraved in the coin linked all of the ways in which Jesus's community suffered under empire. We've seen the challenge posted in Romans, which is frequently interpreted as a statement of individual moral behavior without looking at the ways in which social and cultural systems are organized to exploit people within those systems. And throughout, we've been asked to imagine how we as Christians are called to live in ways that don't simply spiritualize our beliefs, but recognize that professed belief in a Messiah whose entire ministry was among and on behalf of the poor and suffering needs to be matched by enacted commitments within our own contexts to do the same. There's nothing abstract about the call to feed the hungry or clothe the naked or proclaim liberation that bookends Jesus's ministry from his proclamation of Isaiah in Luke 4 to the infamous sheep and goats narrative in Matthew 25. And we do all of this work with each other in the middle of Lent, when we do the internal and external investigation to prepare ourselves for the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth, who was executed at the hands of the state for threatening empire and the status quo. So without further ado, let's bring our teacher back to us one more time, the Reverend Dr. Liz Theoharis. Welcome back, Liz.
Thanks so much. It's good to be with you again this evening.
It's great to have you. Our Thessalonians passage tonight, if you do not work, you shall not eat, will certainly foment some good conversation, but a couple of sort of lingering questions from last week and an update on what's happened in the week since we've seen each other. First, quickly, before we dig into any additional thoughts, one of our participants from last week asked a question we didn't get to answer at the end of Q&A. And it is, how do we distinguish charity from justice? So could you please say a word about that?
Yeah, so I really appreciate this question and think about it a lot. I've written about it a lot, in fact, as well. I think often people say, well, should I, in the words of Micah 6, do justice or love mercy, right? But actually we have to do it all, right? We have to be meeting people's immediate needs. We have to be saving people from economic ruin and hardship. We have to be, feeding folks and making sure they have health care. And we have to be transforming the structures that make those injustices a reality. And if we're not actually working on both of those, we most likely aren't actually really in touch with people that are in struggle. And we're probably not making as much progress as we need to, that we're called to from our sacred texts and traditions. And so, I think often we understand kind of charity work to be about, meeting immediate need, about, cleaning up neighborhoods and volunteering at soup kitchens. It means, doing a GoFundMe page for someone to pay for a healthcare operation that they cannot afford, pooling money together to bury loved ones, all of these kind of day-to-day mutual aid solidarity acts that people are doing across this country and across this world. And I think what we understand justice is to, transform society in a way through policy, through advocacy, through organizing, through movement building, where you don't have to keep on kind of putting band-aids on deep social and economic wounds. And so, I think there is a difference, but the answer is that we need them both together, and that when we meet needs and advocate for structures and systems and policies that make the meeting of needs no longer necessary, that's when we're really actually doing justice, loving mercy, and walking humbly with God.
You're reminding me of an old story that's often shared. People are standing by the riverbank and babies start floating down the river, and people start madly pulling these babies out to save their lives until finally somebody asks, maybe we need to go upriver and see why the babies are ending up in the river in the first place. So pulling the babies out is, by your definition, the meeting of the immediate needs. And going upriver is the move towards justice to keep the babies from ending up in the river in the first place. Those babies still need to be pulled out of the river. So it's not as though it's a zero-sum game and one needs to replace the other. They are both necessary, meeting the immediate needs as well as changing the structures, is what I hear you saying.
Indeed.
So I see the Reverend Barber has been very busy this past week, particularly with the Poor People's Campaign in West Virginia, and Senators Manchin from West Virginia and Sinema from Arizona are in the hot seat. Can you tell us a little bit about what's going on there?
Yeah, so I mean, my guess is that folks are following some of this, both COVID relief package and living wage, Raise the Wage Act. But currently, you know, 2 Democratic senators. The reason that the Democrats have control of the Senate is because of candidates who ran in this past election, including in Georgia, who talked about raising wages, who talked about a just COVID relief bill, who talked about, you know, addressing systemic racism and injustice. And yet we have senators who wouldn't have this much power in this moment, who are threatening not to vote for a bill that raises the living wage from $7.25 on a national level to $15 an hour. And so we had a meeting last week with Senator Manchin out of West Virginia. He actually reached out to the West Virginia Poor People's Campaign and said, because he heard we'd been putting a bunch of pressure at his offices and on these online Moral Mondays that we've been organizing. So we sat down, and, you know, myself and Reverend Barber as the co-chairs of the campaign, but mostly it was, you know, a number of different low-wage workers and unemployed folk from West Virginia, his own constituents, who are saying not only why West Virginia needs, but why the rest of the country needs 15. And then folks decided to do a kind of a socially distanced protest outside of his offices in Charleston, West Virginia, this past Monday. That office is actually right between the Lottery building in Charleston, and then his building, you know, where the senator's office is. And Reverend Barber and folk were making the kind of comparison that right now, you know, people's best, you know, hope for any kind of economic prosperity is like basically a lottery, right? And that instead of you know, society and those who have been elected to serve people, you know, had better listen to the fact that the will of people, vast numbers, vast majority of people in this country are saying that a $15 an hour wage must increase. And so we had an online Moral Monday program on Monday. We'll have one this coming Monday. Hopefully folk will decide to join. We're surely keeping up the pressure on these senators and on the Senate in general, and Congress overall, to make sure that actually what needs to happen in terms of raising wages, in terms of expanding healthcare, in terms of a just COVID relief, unlike, you know, even that first CARES Act there, where 84% of all that money went to corporations and people really got so little of it.
So one of the things that we keep on hearing in the chat pod and Q&A, in emails that we get in between sessions, is continued pushback against the fight for 15, saying that it's going to cause inflation. It's not good economic policy, that this idea that it's going to be lifting everybody up from the bottom will simply be met by inflation and increased costs for the basic things that people purchase. And for those folks who want to continue to underscore the reasons for their support for the fight for 15, could you please say a few words that might help them respond to those who make these arguments?
Yeah, I mean, so one of my favorite moments of the Moral Monday that we did this past Monday was
Mhm.
I got to bring on and interview a little bit Thea Lee, who is the president of the Economic Policy Institute. Economist herself has worked for decades at the intersection of policy and economy, right?
Right.
And what's best for the economy. And you know what she has said over and over again is that, you know, what is right, you know, paying people what they deserve, what they can,
Mhm.
uh, is also good economics. And that you know, folks can come up with various arguments that say that we should be indexing, we should have less money for poorer places, or that this is going to cause inflation. And that overall, if we look, you know, at other kind of increases in wages, um, that isn't what happens, right? I mean, I live in New York City.
Yep.
We have a minimum wage of $15 an hour.
Mhm.
I grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and much of the stuff I buy here in New York City is far cheaper than when I go to Milwaukee and buy stuff there.
Wow.
My cost of living might be pretty high because I spend a lot on the apartment I rent, and you know, there are some costs, but that's more particular to New York. It's not that McDonald's charges me any more than that dollar off the dollar menu in New York, where workers, minimum wage workers, are making 15, or in Milwaukee, where they're making far less. And so what we see across the economy isn't that actually the way we should be talking about inflation is that if wages had kept up with inflation, then the
Mhm.
demand that Dr. King had at the March on Washington in 1963 for $2 of a minimum wage would be $15, right? So we've had all of these years to not do what folks were demanding back in 1963, right? And so if we want to talk about inflation, we should talk about the fact that stuff hasn't kept up with inflation, and that what we have now is tens of millions of more people who are living in poverty. With the 7.25 minimum wage, there is not one county, town, city anywhere in these United States where a minimum wage worker working full time can afford to even rent a 2-bedroom apartment, right?
Mhm.
So an argument against a $15 an hour raise is just that. It's an argument about paying people justly. And in fact, in West Virginia, where Senator Manchin is saying they can do 11 but not 15, it would take $23 an hour to actually have a living wage in his very state. And so already $15 an hour is a compromise. And so anyone that wants to argue that the $368 billion that will be brought into the economy over years, if 50 million workers are paid $15 an hour and not $7.25 or $8.75 or the various things that they're being paid right now, like that really lifts things up. Now, the corporations don't want you to hear that. The folks that are they're funding the political campaigns of many of our politicians don't want us to hear that.
Mhm.
But economists are telling us, and what we can see from actually the way that things play out is that it it that this inflation argument is not true, and that or it's not a direct correlation, right? Um,
Mhm.
and that people need a higher wage. It's insane to have so many people, you know, uh, basically half of the workforce making less than $15 an hour. That's in a country that is rich enough to produce anything, to have $1 trillion of profit made by the richest billionaires in the country. And in just this past year in a pandemic, to argue that we can't pay workers more is just that. It's an argument against justice.
One of the things I'm watching in our chat pod here is somebody just said the fight for 15 is about pulling folks out of the river. In the end, we're still going to have to go further upstream, probably to address the very thing that you just mentioned, which is the gap between the tops and bottoms of the economic gap, which is greater than any other time in American history, from what I understand, the distance between the poorest and the richest Americans. Without further ado, let us go to our last question, which is a wonderfully provocative one, and then we'll set you loose on our text for this evening. One of our participants says, we've been talking about big topics like empire and liberation, ending structural poverty. We've talked about the bad behavior of Ananias and Sapphira, for example, who didn't turn over the proceeds of the sale of their property and then lied about it. We avoid texts in our churches, the true meaning of things like the Beatitudes. But we've also got exemplars, people like Nicodemus, or the women who provided the spices for Jesus's body for burial. One of our participants would like to hear your thoughts on how the comfortable, which probably constitute the majority of our participants this evening, fit into the narrative of good news to the poor, liberty to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, liberation to the oppressed, and proclamation of the year of the Lord's favor.
No, so this is a really important question, because yes, I am someone who follows the belief that a movement needs to take place, and that movement must be led by those that are most impacted. And I am also a biblical scholar and read, those same passages that say, blessed are you the poor, and woe to you who are rich, or the Magnificat, where we're gonna lift up the poor and
send the rich away hungry.
and send the rich away hungry, right? But what I think actually, like, kind of where we stand in all of this, is that if we're living in this kind of unequal society, it impacts everybody. I live in New York City, and some years ago, in the subway system, there were 3 deaths that happened over the course of maybe a week. The death of a maintenance man, the death of a homeless man, and a death of a dog. And over the course of the following week, a bunch of calls came in, about 100, not quite. And 95 of those calls were for the maintenance man. 1 or 2 of those calls were for the dog, and no calls were for the homeless man. Now, the response to that question, to that kind of story, is just like, oh, that's terrible. But it shows that we have devalued life, poor people's lives, Black people's lives, Indigenous people's lives, so much that it doesn't just impact the homeless. It doesn't just impact the poor. It means that we all aren't able to live as fully. And so just like, Jesus coming to bring abundant life to all, that's what a movement is about. It's about abundant life for all. So it isn't that the comfortable shouldn't be comfortable. It's just everybody should have a right to that kind of comfort. And it's not that if I turn my lights off, that will make someone else be able to turn their lights on. It's that we live in a society where we can have utilities and electricity and light, and that, like, and so to me, the message of both the Bible and of social movements throughout history is that it takes everyone, including people with wealth, with a conscience. It always has, and it always will. And what people's role are in the movement isn't just to bring resources, though it is beautiful when those women show up at the tomb with the spices, right? It is amazing when, someone who is wealthy is able to contribute from their abundance but again, that the answer isn't that the movement just needs the resources of those more comfortable. The movement needs those people, and the people need a movement, because otherwise we're going to continue to live in a society that devalues life. And that isn't good for anyone. The states that have, as we looked at those maps a couple of weeks ago, those states that have, the highest voter suppression, that have the highest poverty, have the highest inequality, including in the places where there's real wealth and real prosperity. They're the sickest societies. That actually inequality is a better measure for how sick a society is than just poverty. And that shows that poverty actually impacts the middle and the rich, as well as the poor. Now, it impacts poor people, homeless people disproportionately. I'm not saying that the pain is the same, but we would be lying to ourselves if we were to say that we need a moral movement and a moral revival just to save the 43% of Americans who are poor and low income. We needed to save the whole society, the soul of our whole society. And it's going to take people with resources to band together with people without resources to actually build this kind of movement. Because a movement is the moving of bodies and of minds and of masses of people, including folks that have, a comfortable life that they know that other people deserve. Not that they're going to sacrifice and someone else is going to get something good, but we're all going to organize and sacrifice together to be able to have everybody living a thriving life. And so I think that this is, I'm hoping actually we'll look at this concept a little bit more today in the text that we're going to look at, starting with the Thessalonians text, because I think it is a message about how people with resources are to use their resources for the good of everyone.
We'll now turn it over to Tyler, who will begin us with a video. And thank you, Liz, for being with us.
We are a new unsettling force. You say that?
We are a new unsettling force.
And we are powerful.
And we are powerful.
We are a new unsettling force.
We are a new unsettling force.
And we are here.
And we are here.
We are a new unsettling force.
We are a new unsettling force.
For liberation.
For liberation.
And we got nothing to lose.
And we got nothing to lose.
But our chains.
But our chains.
We are a new unsettling force, and we are powerful. A new unsettling force, and we're here. A new unsettling force for liberation, and we got nothing to lose but our chains. We are a new unsettling force, and we are powerful. A new unsettling force, and we're here. A new unsettling force for liberation, and we got nothing to lose but our chains. And we got nothing to lose but our chains. And we got nothing to lose but our chains. And we got nothing to lose but our chains. And we got nothing to lose but our
So it's so good to be with everybody. And I wanted to actually put a little context to that video. I've been using various videos, as I've said before, because you can find all of these videos on the Poor People's Campaign website. And I think sometimes they're a powerful resource for leaders and congregations and communities across the country. And that one is based on really probably what is my favorite quote from Reverend Dr. King, where he says in December of '67, as he was announcing the launching of the Poor People's Campaign, that the poor and dispossessed of this nation live in a cruelly unjust society. If they can be helped to take action together, they will do so with a new and unsettling force in our complacent national life. And then from there, he kind of goes on to announce the idea of bringing thousands of poor people to Washington to engage in massive nonviolent civil disobedience, and this idea that helping the poor to take action together, and unsettling and this kind of complacent national life, this nation that is too used to, as Reverend Barber often says, like a death, a kind of a death measurement. This nation where we just get kind of comfortable with how many folks are suffering, how many winter storms are ravaging, places that they really have no place. How many, police are engaging in violent acts against the very citizens that they're vowing to protect and serve. And so I just wanted to kind of start there, and then to move to just the overall theme of what these past weeks have been about, and this week as well. And maybe Tyler can pull up the slideshow. We've been looking at these difficult texts, and this evening, indeed, I want to look at this one from 2 Thessalonians. If you do not work, you will not eat. So I want to, before we kind of look at that text, I want to go to this next slide and read this quote that came out about a year ago. If we can go to the next slide. That comes from Jerry Falwell Jr. When he was kind of voicing some support for Donald Trump. But I think it has a lot to do with the overall conversation that we've been having these past couple of weeks, and then surely the one around 2 Thessalonians today. Jerry Falwell, in this kind of larger piece that he wrote, and these are just a couple of sentences from it. It's such a distortion of the teachings of Jesus to say that what he taught us to do personally, to love our neighbors as ourselves, help the poor, can somehow be imputed on a nation. It's a distortion of the teaching of Christ to say Jesus taught love and forgiveness, and therefore the United States as a nation should be loving and forgiving and just hand over everything we have to every other part of the world. Think about it. Why have Americans been able to do more to help people in need around the world than any other country in history? It's because of free enterprise, freedom, ingenuity, entrepreneurism, wealth. A poor person never really gave anyone a job. A poor person never gave anybody charity, not of any real volume. It's just common sense to me. So I would actually be really curious throughout the whole conversation that I'm going to be having right now, if folks did actually want to put into the chat, reactions or responses to this and to the other kind of quotes and ideas that I'm going to be putting out there, because I think it's really important to start with this quote, because this is actually what looking at these difficult texts is all about. This is what kind of engaging in a battle for biblical ideas and interpretations is about. Like this idea that it's a distortion of the teachings of Jesus to say that what he taught people to do personally, and we were talking about this a lot last week, that actually individual actions, individual behavior isn't really what most of our biblical texts are talking so much about. They're responding to how those who are leading nations and societies are being charged about organizing, and that in fact, again, in a passage like Matthew 25 that is so often used actually to talk about individual acts of charity. When I was hungry, you fed me. When I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. We must remember that indeed the opening of that passage and of that parable in the Matthew 25 text is that the ruler is sitting in front of the nations, and that this is actually a message to the nations. This idea also that love and forgiveness is about how a nation is supposed to be organized, or this idea that that poor people have never contributed anything to society, not only is, probably makes some people here at least kind of uncomfortable. It's also just blatantly not true. When you look at who has been donating money in this pandemic, if you look at when different storms destroy communities and who comes forward to support the Red Cross and its efforts, it's on average always poor folk middle income folk who are giving so much more of people's resources than folks with real wealth and power. And so I think that it's helpful for us to kind of, think about how this context of these teachings and of this kind of this theological assumptions in our society today. So maybe we'll go to the next slide and then we'll read from this text from 2 Thessalonians 3. And I'm appreciating very much the conversation that's happening in the chat at the same time. So this text from 2 Thessalonians is obviously a letter to a Pauline community in Thessaloniki, in an island kind of Greece. And as we know, there's two letters to the Thessalonians, and that's why this is the second one. And these are indeed letters that are attributed to Paul. There's a whole kind of conflict that's building in this text, and Paul's responding to it. And it says, "Now we command you, beloved, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, to keep away from believers who are living in idleness and not according to the tradition that they received from us. For you yourselves know how you ought to imitate us. We were not idle when we were with you. We did not eat anyone's bread without paying for it, but with toil and labor we worked day and night, so that we might not burden any of you. This was not because we do not have that right, but in order to give you an example to imitate. For even we were with you, we gave you this command: anyone unwilling to work should not eat. For we hear that some of you are living in idleness, mere busybodies, not doing any work." So I want us to kind of sit in that text a little bit, because kind of the main way it's been interpreted for so many years probably is the way we heard it right now. And so if we go to the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about, some of my introduction to this text. I was raised in the church. I was going to church and seeing it as my second home from when I was a tiny child. I had a little Winnie the Pooh bag with some coloring books and crayons and balls that I just brought with me every couple of days when I was at church, because it was such a home to me. I was a Sunday school teacher by the age of 13. I was a deacon by the age of 16. I knew my Bible. I studied it well, but it was not until in the middle 1990s, as the debate around the welfare reform law came kind of into, onto the scene, that I actually heard this text ever. And it's not that my church didn't study Paul. We totally did. In fact, my pastor at the time, closed every sermon with Paul's words of "think on these things." And so, but it wasn't until, our politicians were talking about, attaching work requirements to welfare, ending the federal entitlement of welfare, being able to put lifetime limits on kind of any social safety net for moms and their kids, that I ever heard this passage. In more recent years, we can see, what's up here on this slide. We have various, representatives who quote this verse, particularly to kind of justify these kind of work requirements for folks on SNAP. My favorite was to actually follow this whole debate that as it came out, a couple of years ago, where this anti-hunger group, Mason, I don't know if folks are familiar with it, they do really powerful work. I mean, they're a Jewish organization, but that feeds a lot of mouths. We're talking about Leviticus, and we're talking about the Hebrew scriptures, and this commandment, this obligation to feed those who are hungry and to really organize, society around the needs of the hungry and poor. And here you have this representative, who's just out there, basically rebutting, Jewish leadership, talking about what the Bible really says about these issues. Before that, in the Farm Bill in 2013, I mean, like really, we could kind of go every year, every other year from dating back from now, definitely to earlier than the 1990s. And you see this text used all the time to basically talk about punishing poor people for their hunger and for their poverty. And I'm no stranger to this, not just because I learned about it in the welfare reform debates, but I write and I speak a lot of places these days, and very, very regularly I get Twitter responses or Facebook posts or other kind of rebuttals and comments where folks are just reminding me and larger society that poor people deserve basically to starve. So I'm going to have us go to the next slide, because I think it's actually important, just like we were talking a little bit about last week, to put the context, the historical, economic, political context, into the conversation as we interpret this text. There really were two social groups, two economic groups that were living around the time of Jesus and the time of Paul and the time of writing these letters. You had elites who made up between 5 and 10% of society, and you had the rest of people who were poor, who either made their living serving the elite or barely were able to kind of survive a subsistence living, kind of trying to live off the land. Go to the next slide. I think it's actually important to think a little bit about how wealth is, amassed and acquired. There was taxation, as we talked about, when we were looking at the coins with Caesar's face on it. There's interest, usury, as our biblical text would call it, that is alive and well. There's inheritance of like people passing down the wealth that they had. There's also just in general kind of these huge landowners who are sometimes renting out their land basically to farm workers, to sharecroppers, more or less, to try to like have the wealthy be able to really profit from what's being produced, and have the workers just keep on being able to barely live. Also at this time is as the Roman Empire is kind of establishing itself and continuing to grow and kind of conquer more, there's also kind of some other economic shifts that are taking place, an increase in trade, an increase in kind of the fishing industry. There's also obviously pretty vast military conquest, and at the base of that conquest, that war, that taxation is always slavery. I mean, we constantly have to kind of remember that. And then I think it's kind of helpful to think a little bit about like who is kind of helping to hold up the wealthy in society. What biblical scholars and archaeologists would call kind of the retainers of empire. And I think this is really important. Like the first is actually priests, actually religious leaders, right? Many of whom are appointed by the political powers to be the religious leaders of the day. And then also they play this kind of ideological role of kind of marrying inequality and empire and where God is in the world. And then other kind of type of retainer that like folks that kind of keep this system going are the tax collectors, the bureaucrats, the soldiers, the judges, those that are in jobs that kind of keep the Roman Empire running. And again, we should always notice that those folks, both the religious leaders and the tax collectors and soldiers and judges, like make it into our biblical stories quite a bit, because again, this is like who is kind of, we might not see Caesar a ton in our texts. It might show up in the birth story in Luke, where we know that, who's in power, or it might, show up in the close to the crucifixion that we are reminded who's the governor. But mostly the way that poor people related to the empire was through these kind of workers, but that worked to protect the elite. We're going to go to the next slide, please. And then you had this vast majority of people who are poor. And they're basically workers of all types, right? It's artisans and construction workers and sailors and longshoremen and dyers and weavers and tailors and tanners and metalsmiths and dancers and food vendors. And at the very bottom of all of these different, basically poor workers are day laborers and slaves and other expendables. And so that even though we also know in our texts, both in the Gospels and also in our Pauline letters, we're hearing some about the tax collectors, we're hearing some about the judges. We're hearing a lot about the laborers, the slaves, and the other kind of expendables, because this is who Jesus is hanging out with. This is who make up the initial kind of what they call Christ cults that make up the Pauline communities. And what's really important, again, is to like not kind of dematerialize the reality of poor people in the Roman Empire, nor to dematerialize the reality of poor people living in our world today. The most serious problem for folks that were living both in the urban centers, which are where Paul is kind of writing to, but also this was true amongst the farmers of Galilee, where Jesus is hanging out as well. But the most serious problem, especially for Paul's communities, is not having enough food, like not being able to feed one's family. And so starvation and being hungry is a daily reality. I mean, it's not just hunger. It's not just starvation. Folks are living, in really inadequate housing, have no real healthcare system, don't have, and again, we hear this lots of places in our biblical texts, just people don't have clothes, lots of these realities. And what we also know is that there's, violence, violence at work, violence in the society. And what we surely know, and part of the reason our biblical texts, not just in the Roman Empire, not just in our New Testament scriptures, but throughout the Hebrew Bible as well, are constantly talking about this kind of, this goal, this desire, this dream of old age, because it's so uncommon because of the harsh conditions of life. Next slide. Oh, actually, let's take this slide down for a minute, and I'll just talk for a minute. Thank you. So the reason I kind of put this kind of reality, or try to paint this picture, is because I think it's hard for us to then look at 2 Thessalonians 3 without having that picture, because we otherwise read into our text that there isn't hunger, and that there aren't people that are struggling to find food, and that it's just kind of a immaterial or spiritual debate about, who's in and who's out, who's worthy and who's unworthy. When you kind of forget and spiritualize the reality of these communities. And so in that context, I want to read again and have folks listen to this text from 2 Thessalonians 3. It says, "Now we command you, beloved, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, to keep away from believers who are living in idleness, not according to the tradition that they received from us. For you yourselves know how you ought to imitate us. We were not idle when we were with you, and we did not eat anyone's bread without paying for it. But with toil and labor, we worked night and day so that we might not burden any of you. This was not because we do not have that right, but in order to give you an example to imitate. For even when we were with you, we gave you this command: anyone unwilling to work should not eat. For we hear that some of you are living in idleness, mere busybodies, not doing any work." Now, if we kind of go back to that schema of who is who in the Roman Empire, the poor are workers. That's who is toiling. And these Greek words are describing very arduous work, very hard work. The poor are working night and day. The poor are never having a chance to be idle. This is never actually a word that is used to describe poor people. It's because you would die if you stopped working, because you're barely making enough to be able to feed yourself, to be able to have the basics to live another day. But who is idle in the Roman Empire, in this schema, the system, are those who have inherited wealth, those who are profiting off of the conquest of other nations, those who are able to pass all of the work that they have onto the slaves that they own. And so even just by the very words that are being used in this text, we're actually told that who this critique is against isn't poor people, isn't people that are not able to feed their families, isn't people on the brink of starvation. The people who are being critiqued in this text are those who have enough resources, because what's happening in the Christian movement at this time is all kinds of different folks are joining. What began as kind of mutual solidarity ecclesias amongst poor people are now diversifying. More people are hearing the message. More people are joining the movement. And this is causing real tension. Part of that tension is that there are some folk that are used to not working, the non-poor folk. Some of them might be the tax collectors or the other kind of positions that we've heard, the judges in society. And those folks are coming into this community, and they're expecting the poor to serve them like they do in the rest of their lives. And this can't stand. This isn't going to work. Not for a movement, not for a way, not for these kind of ecclesias that are bringing people together across diversity, across difference, with a common kind of goal of justice and righteousness and love and respect. And so I just think it's important for us to kind of hear that in this text, that again, even this instruction of we hear some of you are living in idleness, mere busybodies, not doing any work. The mere busybodies aspect, it kind of goes back to some of the things we were talking about last week of these kind of critiques of those who would have and would use their wealth and their power to basically exploit and use people and the earth and resources. And again, it's not instruction that poor people deserve not to have food unless they have work requirements attached to their welfare check, but instead that society should be organized in a way that everybody's contributing, that what's gonna, break this community apart is when you have rich people assuming that poor people are there just to serve them, and reminding that this, this might work in empire, but this doesn't work in God's empire. So I want us to then bring the slides back up, if you don't mind, and I'm going to have us go forward. Yes, exactly. So this is, I just want to read a couple of these different biblical quotes, and I want to suggest that actually that if you do not work, you shall not eat is more in line with something like James 5. The wages you failed to pay the workers who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. Or from Matthew 5, no one can serve two masters. You cannot serve God and money, or sometimes it's interpreted or translated mammon, right? Or Acts 2, what we talked about, the first week. All who believed were together and had all things in common. They would sell their possessions and goods and display the proceeds to all as any had need. Day by day, as they spent time together in the temple, they broke bread at home and ate food with glad and generous hearts, praising God, having goodwill of all the people. So I want to have us think a little bit about that Act 2 text, and think about how, what if we're kind of juxtaposing this scene where people are selling their possessions and goods and making sure that everybody has what they need, that they're growing as they kind of spend time together, worshiping and eating and building community together, and again worshiping God, the God who led people out of Egypt, and who would lead them out of imperial persecution, and thinking about the goodwill of all people. And so I think that one of the things that is really important about this whole kind of text is that this is an option, right? It's possible to have a diverse grouping of people with resources and without resources, all together, kind of making sure that when we lift from the bottom, everybody can rise. But that also what's possible when you bring these different people, different experiences, different jobs together, that folks can kind of fall back into what we're most used to and what we're most kind of comfortable with, because that's how society is organized. And so I think about that text when we're thinking, when we're kind of looking at Acts 2 versus the 2 Thessalonians text. I'll have us go to the next slide, because what I want us to do here is to think some about what Paul really has to say about how do we address starvation, hunger, and poverty. And is it that the 2 Thessalonians text, where if you do not work, you shall not eat, is really about poor people, or if it's really a message for those that have more resources? Because again, what's true about Paul's letters, and 1 and 2 Thessalonians being among them, is that throughout these letters is this kind of project. It's called the collection for the poor. And often we talk about the collection in our churches, at least in my experience, on like Stewardship Sunday, right? And we talk some about how other texts that are about the collection, that God loves a cheerful giver, right? But I want us to actually look at these texts, because Paul does have an anti-poverty program, a solution to the hunger of his communities and of other communities across the empire that are kind of coming together to build a new life in this project of the collection for the poor. Many scholars will say that actually what gets Paul executed is the collection. and folks kind of debate whether the collection was an alternative to taxation. And we talked about this a little bit in the context of the render unto Caesar and the coins of the empire. And that perhaps what Paul is doing here is suggesting that this collection being voluntary is unlike taxation, which is mandated. But it's also about, perhaps it could be about tax evasion, but if that tax evasion is taking place here, it's because folks are being asked to basically, instead of supporting the works of empire, to support the movement of poor people in Paul's communities, in Jesus movement communities across the empire. So I want us to read this from 2 Corinthians 8. We want you to know, brothers and sisters, about the grace of God that has been granted to the churches of Macedonia. For during a very severe ordeal of affliction, their abundant joy and their extreme poverty have overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part. For, as I can testify, they voluntarily gave according to their means, and even beyond their means, begging us earnestly for the privilege of sharing in this ministry to the saints. And this, not merely as we expected, they gave themselves first to the Lord and by the will of God to us. So I want us to kind of pause for a second and think about this, and then we'll keep on reading. There's more of this text. But you know, there's a number of clues in this text that are also clues in the Second Thessalonians text that are reminding us of that kind of social and economic context that I started us with. You know, folks are living in extreme poverty, right? That's the words that are here. There's a severe ordeal of affliction. Now, folks think, you know, can kind of time and look back and know that there was actually a famine that basically kind of was in the land. And what we know about famines, including in our day now, is that they're usually politically imposed. It's not necessarily that there's not enough. It's that those who have the power and the wealth and the land, you know, kind of hoard to be able to kind of create scarcity. And so that kind of thing happens here. And yet you have these poor Macedonians who are collecting money and sending money to poor, you know, what they've called here a ministry to the saints. Now, the saints are some of the first Jesus followers and the folks that were building, you know, the Jesus movement after Jesus's crucifixion. And so what this is describing is a project where poor people in these different Christian communities but that are across all this difference, are raising money and sending it to like the kind of headquarters of the movement, to be able to build up this movement, to continue to try to advocate and build the power necessary to be able to you know, bring God's reign of abundance here on earth, right? To enact the Jubilee codes, to be able to, you know, see the forgiveness of debt and the release of slaves and the year of God's favor. And so this is what's going on in these Pauline communities. And it's part of actually how everybody comes together and how this whole system of churches across the empire works. You have these letters and you have these apostles, but you also have this mutual aid project amongst the poor that is taking place. Can we go to the next slide? And then it continues, for you know the generous act of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sakes he became poor, so that by his poverty you might become rich. And in this matter, I am giving you my advice. It is appropriate for you who began last year, not only to do something, but even to desire to do something. Now finish doing it, so that your eagerness may be matched by completing it according to your means. For if the eagerness is there, the gift is acceptable according to what one has, not according to what one does not have. I do not mean that there should be a relief for others and a pressure on you, but it is a question of a fair balance between your, sorry, I have to find it. I can't read it. That's funny. Between your present abundance and their need, so that their abundance may be for your need, in order that there may be a fair balance. As it is written, the one who had much did not have too much, and the one who had little did not have too little. So this last quote is a quote reminding us of the manna, right? And here we have this reminder that if we're doing what God wants of us, coming together in diverse communities, some folks with resources, some folks with mostly poverty and low wages, but still coming together and trying to build a society that's for everyone, that God's intention is that the ones who had much didn't have too much, and the ones who have little don't have too little. God's intention is not that those who are starving shouldn't have any food. God's intention is not that that like if that those who don't have to work because they're so wealthy should just live off the toil of others. God's desire is that everybody should be able to have really the right to thrive, and that this is over and over again seen, whether it's starting in the manna and going through the kind of Jubilee, going through the practices of the prophets, you know, the reality of the Gospels, but then also continuing even here until this collection for the poor. So I want to kind of pause for a second and have us just, you know, take all of that in, of just like, so what does it mean that 2 Thessalonians isn't just saying that hunger is inevitable, that poverty is inevitable, that poor people don't deserve anything? What does it mean, the idea that those who had little should never have too little, right? But instead, that we can work it out as people of faith, as people that are being observant of these commandments, and of people who are striving to bring this reality, this reign, this empire of God here in the present. So I want us to kind of, since this is the last week, I want us to then do a couple of other texts that are also about kind of material conditions of people. So we're going to go to the next slide. This one is from Luke, right? You know, just to think a little bit about this text from Luke 12, and the next couple of slides are all of this, and we'll just keep on going through it. And he said to them, "Take care, be on your guard against all kinds of greed, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions." So I want to pause for a second and think about being on guard against all kinds of greed. And what if that 2 Thessalonians community is that there's kind of greed creeping in, an expectation of the poor serving the more wealthy creeping in. But then we're reminded, you know, life doesn't consist in the abundance of possessions. And then it continues. Then he told them a parable. The land of a rich man produced abundantly. And he thought to himself, "What should I do? For I have no place to store my crops." Then he said, "I will do this. I will put down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up in for many, many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry." But God said to him, "You fool, this very night your life is being demanded of you. And the things you have prepared, whose will they be? So it is with those who store up treasures for themselves, but are not rich toward God." So, you know, again, some of these parables are texts that are kind of talking about this reality of the kind of deprivation, of the poverty of that society, but they also, you know, speak to our reality today as well, and this idea of kind of storing up and and hoarding, and not figuring out ways that society is organized to make sure that everybody has an adequate standard of living. And I think the other piece that's happening in this Luke text is it's reminding us of where kind of poverty is created, at least in the Bible. I don't know if folks have studied the kind of storehouses that happen in Genesis at the end of it, when Joseph is with Pharaoh and is interpreting his dreams. The first place where the word poor shows up in the Bible is in Joseph's interpretation of Pharaoh's dream. And in that interpretation, it's that there's going to be, 7 years of, beautiful abundance, and then 7 years of famine. And the way that he comes to that is that there are 7, fat, lovely cows, and then there are 7 poor, ugly cows. And then what happens is that, as I think we probably are pretty familiar with the story, what happens is that Joseph suggests, well, what we can do now that we know that there's going to be these 7 years of abundance and then 7 years of famine, is that we can then build storehouses, and we can collect all of the abundance of society, and we can hold that, so that then when there are 7 years of famine, the people in the land have what they need. So they do that, and they build up these storehouses. They build up these huge barns, and then even bigger ones to hold all of the kind of grain. Because of this is how Egypt actually becomes the place that has all of these resources, and all these other nations, including Judea, have to come, right? And so Jacob comes with his other kids, Joseph's brothers, who had sold him, and kind of sees what's going on, and it continues, because then, at first, when the famine hits, people are hungry, and so they go to these storehouses, and what's happening is that the storehouses are set up in a way that people have to pay for that grain, and so first people spend all of their resources, and then they basically have to give up their land, and then after they've given up their resources and their land, they then sell themselves into slavery. And this is actually how the slavery of the Exodus starts. It starts actually, with these storehouses, these bigger and bigger barns, these huge places to kind of pull and organize and store and hoard resources, and then to be used to kind of bring the people in as slaves and take the land. And so when we're reading Luke 2, it's a reference back to those storehouses, and to societies that over and over again basically hoard and then use those resources to deepen poverty, to bring about enslavement, and to bring about a deeply unequal society. And so it's in this context then we can keep on looking in Luke 12. We go to the next slide, and we go to some other passages that probably any of us that are interested in anti-poverty work hear all the time. Of consider the lilies, how they grow, they neither toil nor spin. But if God so clothes the grass of the field, which is alive today and tomorrow is thrown into the oven, how much more will he clothe you, you of little faith? Do not keep striving for what you are to eat and what you are to drink, and do not keep worrying, for it is the nations of the world that strive after these things, and your Father knows that you need them. Instead, strive for his kingdom, and all these things will be given to you as well. Now, I've heard this text also used in a way where, people shouldn't be worried about material things, that what you're supposed to do is put your eyes on God and the Spirit, and But what if, again, in this context of deep starvation, of deep poverty, this context of knowing where storehouses come from and the hoarding of empire, and the impoverishment and enslavement of people, what if this message is about, folks not striving to basically build up empire, but instead poor people hearing this message that in God's reign, in God's kingdom, in God's empire, all of this food and abundant life is there, and is there for everybody to benefit from. And I think that there is something really so powerful about this passage then, where it's not telling you that you shouldn't worry about your economic condition, but that, in God's reign, in the way that this would happen for under God's rules is, and therefore what we as people who follow God should be doing is striving for God's reign, and therefore for manna, therefore for jubilee, therefore for preaching good news, evangelion to the poor. And so it continues if we go to the next slide. For do not be afraid, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions, give alms, make purses for yourselves that do not wear out, an unfailing treasure in heaven where no thief comes near and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there your heart will also be. I think we often hear this, where your treasure is, there your heart will also be. And another way of saying it sometimes in our work in the Poor People's Campaign and what we do at Kairos Center is we talk about, that budgets are moral documents, that what a society, what a congregation, what the world does with the resources that we have at our disposal, tells us much about what kind of society we are. So the fact that the United States spends 53 cents of every discretionary dollar on the military and less than 15 cents on healthcare and education and anti-poverty programs combined should tell us a little bit about where our hearts are, because our hearts are in war. Our hearts are in kind of warmongering. Our hearts are in, lining the pockets of military contractors. Our hearts are not in making sure that kids have food when they go to bed, and making sure that kids are being able to go to really good schools, not resegregated ones. Our hearts are not in trying to figure out how to have healthcare for everybody in society. Our hearts are not at trying to make sure that we abolish poverty. Because if what the budget of our nation looks like, or even sometimes what the budget of our congregations look like, you can tell more about what we care about. And sometimes it doesn't line up with what God's budget probably would be. I'm seeing a little bit of the text, and I was thinking some about in various churches that I've been in throughout my life, where we do spend so much of our resources on our buildings, and so little of our resources on making our building and our church, in our congregation, be the kind of community center and liberatory place for people who are experiencing hardship. And again, it's not an indictment of us. It's a suggestion that we could do better, and that God desires for us too. So I want to go to this one last slide, and then we have a little video, and then we'll have some Q&A. But because we started early in the conversation about this question of charity, I wanted to kind of bring up this quote from William Sloane Coffin, who was an early kind of mentor of mine. He was the senior pastor of the Riverside Church and was very involved in the peace and justice movement that I was kind of raised in. And I've always thought that this quote quote kind of sums up a little bit about kind of charity and justice. He says, many of us are eager to respond to injustice, as long as we can do so without having to confront the causes of it. There's the great pitfall of charity. Handouts to needy individuals are genuine, necessary responses to injustice, but they do not necessarily face the reason for injustice. And that is why so many businesses and governmental leaders today are promoting charity. It is desperately needed in an economy whose prosperity is based on growing inequality. First, these leaders proclaim themselves experts on matters economic and prove it by taking most out of the economy. Then they promote charity as if it were the work of the church finally telling us troubled clergy to shut up and bless the economy as once we blessed the battleships. So I just have you sit with that quote a little bit in terms of in this moment where there are so many business leaders trying to say, and not small business leaders, but you know, some of the richest corporations in the world trying to say that we simply cannot afford to pay low-wage workers that we now call essential living wages. You know, I think there's a different message that's happening, you know, in this quote, but also really in 2 Thessalonians, in Luke 12, in Paul's collection for the poor, in Matthew 26 and 25, and so many of our biblical passages. So I'm going to have us watch this short video just to kind of ground us in what's possible and what we need to do. And then I look forward for us having a couple more questions before we close for the night.
Everybody has got a right. Everybody has got a right. Everybody has got a right. Everybody's got a right to live. Everybody has got a right. Everybody has got a right. Everybody has got a right. Everybody's got a right to live.
I feel this melody in the footsteps of the people, rising up in the rhythm of dignity and courage. When I see you, I suddenly believe liberation can flourish, and generosity and humility will save us. And we will use the love our mamas gave us to decolonize the skies above us with praises. Learning from the bravest, the beautiful, nameless creators of a world newly awakened. We on fire and blazing our way out the matrix, guided by a single mother's hand, holding her family together. We already on the other side of never. We're the aunties brewing tea and sipping sweetness from the south to the north. We are here to remind those in D.C. who they working for. That's right, beloved. This song is Freedom Uncovered.
Everybody has got a right. Everybody has got a right. Everybody has got a right. Everybody's got a right to live. Everybody has got a right. Everybody has got a right. Everybody has got a right. Everybody's got a right to live.
Where Harriet walked towards, what the people in Selma marched for, what the riots from Stonewall to Ferguson to Minneapolis fought for. A movement of people who poor in dollars but rich in brilliance. We are the millions, the healers who come to heal, the leaders who come to reveal that the right to live means you've had the right to feel what you feel. The right to live means an end to police violence and the passage of a Green New Deal. The right to live is in the wind, and every day we witness in our children's countless talents. The right to live is harmonizing in the voice of Yara Allen. It is the springtime and you can feel the right to live about to bloom, growing out the organizing of comrades like Sierra and Sharon and Claudia de la Cruz. Esto es el momento de pararnos como madres orgullosas y sonreír, porque no hay nada más esencial que el derecho de vivir. The right to live is a simple truth to return us to ourselves. It is a spell being cast upon a lost and divided nation to heal the wounds of hate and incarceration with a love so bold it includes everybody. Feel that, everybody. And when you fight for those rights, they become the lights for us to follow through these long dark nights. This is a promise to be radically honest and declare we are worthy of food to eat and housing to sleep in and schools to dream in and just being human beings. We are worthy of love, and so the Poor People's Campaign has come to bring our freedom into being. You will know we've arrived because you will hear us sing.
Everybody's got a right to live. Everybody's got a right to live.
Thanks, Liz. We've got a bunch of questions here. Some are short. I'm going to get a couple of short ones out of the way. The powerful quote from William Sloane Coffin. When did he say those words? Do you have any idea?
Well, I'd have to pull it up. I don't have it off the top of my head now. Sorry.
Okay. Well, we'll find out.
It was towards the end of his life. I mean, it was the more recent quote. It's from the 1990s, but
okay, so it wasn't the 1960s. Okay, great. So one of our participants is asking, basically in terms of the redistribution of wealth, our government requires taxes from the rich and middle class to be given to the poor. They have money, they give money. The poor have time that can be used to help other poor. What's wrong with the government requiring them to pay a time tax that would help the poor? So how would you respond to this?
So, I mean, I think there's a number of things going on here. I mean, one, if we kind of look at the taxation system in the United States, who mostly doesn't pay taxes is the rich. Yes, there are things like the earned income tax credit there, when you go under a certain, percentage, poor people don't pay a ton of income tax, but poor people pay a lot in terms of sales tax, in terms of tolls, in terms of all the other kind of forms of taxation. But, and in fact, poor people pay a lot more in taxes compared to their income than even other kind of economic groups. But mostly the story that isn't told is how little the rich have to pay in taxes. And I think there was a little bit of conversation in the chat about all of that. It would take kind of too long to go into a lot of it, but I think that when we talk about taxes, basically what like the tax cuts that happened in 2017 was the biggest transfer of wealth from the poor to the rich and from the middle to the rich, basically since hundreds of years before. And so tax cuts, like people think that it means that middle class people are gonna not have to pay as much taxes and that poor people already didn't have to pay taxes. But tax cuts usually mean that the wealthiest corporations and individuals don't have to pay their fair share.
I'm also wondering about the assumption that the poor have time on their hands. In my experience, the working poor I know are some of the busiest people I've ever met. I remember speaking with somebody who had been doing some contract work here at the seminary who had to work 2 full-time jobs and slept for 4 hours in between the jobs, and was doing this to sustain their family and to take care of them. So I think the idea that the poor have time, we see in Thessalonians, 2 Thessalonians, that it's the idle rich who are potentially being indicted by Paul. So I'm wondering if you could say something about this perception.
Yeah, no, I think it's really important. I mean, again, half of jobs in this country, or workers in this country, are making less than living wages. Like, so the people that are working the hardest and making but also are the poorest are the poor, right? And this is particularly true, since the 1990s, when kind of most of the social safety net was eliminated or so severely reduced that it's meant that I mean, it never was maybe adequate for folks to be able to really live. But what's happened is that, vast majority of homeless people work. Most of the folks that are poor and low income in this country are people that are working but not making enough to be able to pay bills. And so that is the reality, that poor people work very hard. Also, it's hard work to not know where your next meal is coming from, on top of working 2, 3, 4 jobs.
A lot of people had their imaginations captivated by the description of the idle rich, as you identified the idle folk in 2 Thessalonians. I admit to having had images of the Kardashians and reality TV stars dancing in my head. But some folks are asking some questions about this. Is it possible that Paul's bringing in his own prejudices against social structures of the day into his writing? Is it possible that his concern was the disunity of the church, and some people are agitating and making trouble instead of like getting busy and working on the well-being of the community?
Well, there's no doubt that that's what he's upset about, right? That he's upset that there's disunity. It's just that usually we don't think that disunity could have anything to do with economics and material conditions, and it's pretty impossible in a society where 90% of people are barely surviving, that economics isn't playing a role in it as well. So yes, of course, there's other forms of disunity that are taking place, and some of it's cultural and philosophical, but also what's going on in this passage, just by the word choice of it, and the characterizations of that those words, the meanings that those words have, is that there is something going on around kind of this idleness and this and the kind of gossiping and slandering that, again, is associated with those that hold up empire, either who are retainers for empire or are imperial kind of authorities themselves. And so, I mean, the main issue is, how do people come together across these differences, and how do they build the kind of Christian community that is going to be about paving the way to a better society? But I think what we do a disservice to our understanding of these sacred texts is when we think that there's a way to have a spiritual meaning that is, and a philosophical idea that is separate from the kind of material lifting up of God's people. Because again, it's not everything is reduced to that, but that is a concern as well.
Why did the Acts 2 commune die out? What do we know about the end of the community described in Acts 2?
So we know a number of things. I mean, we know that there are various kind of communes that exist throughout history, including, Christian ones. But I think the story of Acts and that kind of communion of goods is less about one particular community that's a commune. And I think it's more of a way of life that all people are being called to live in. And it doesn't have all the associations of what a commune is. It's that that society is organized around the Jubilee principle. Society is organized around the manna principle. Society is organized around, you know, forgiving debts and paying people what they deserve. And that that this is what those in charge of society, in charge of the laws and legislation, are to do. And so I think that so the story in Acts 2 and Acts 4 is less about, you know, did it happen and when did it die? And it's more about that this is an example of the kind of principles that not just Christians, but society at large are supposed to be, you know, living in.
We are at 9 o'clock. Any final words you'd like to share with folks before we bid you farewell? And thank you very much for sharing your wisdom with us for the month of February.
I enjoy talking about the Bible and thinking about how it relates to the world we're living in. And I hope that folks will stay connected to the Kairos Center and the Poor People's Campaign and National Call for Moral Revival.
Excellent. And friends, those of you who are still on the call, we will be editing these down to make them into bite-sized chunks for you to use with your communities for Bible study or adult education. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here. Blessings on your work, Liz, and we look forward to staying connected with you.
Body wash, whole body.